to you if you were to go there now, given that we have done a great job building residential towers and bringing in singles or at best couples to that. The place is an ideal place to have a wonderful life in the earlier stages of your life when you're starting off with but at the same time, we have built Sigma to what I think is reaching capacity, if not beyond it.
So, I mean, that's very interesting. What would you say about Yonge and Eglinton? I happen to live at Yonge and Eglinton, and so yes, there are people with hockey bags around Yonge and Eglinton, but in terms of a transit capacity, I certainly see that on the platform at rush hour, it's pretty busy. And in the next 10 years, Yonge and Eglinton is certainly going to get a lot more condos being built. So I sort of wonder, at what point is that going to become emergency that, there isn't enough transit at Yonge and Egg? Do you have any thoughts about that?
So Yonge and Eglinton is another interesting place. Now you see that there were corners, or the four corners of the Yonge and Eglinton are now being spoken for, and high rises have already shown up. And if not, they are in the process of being built and along the corridor. And then you see how much throughput capacity there is for commuting, and how much underground infrastructure capacity there is to service new residents. And then at the same time, how much social space in terms of restaurants and recreation and parks and other space that one needs to have a meaningful life other than going to do your work in a subway. I think at some point we have to realize that space gets narrower and narrower and narrower and smaller. And then you ask yourself, is it the time where the fundamental structure of the neighborhood is changing? You may have a family-oriented neighborhood. That used to be the case at Yonge and Eglinton, but if you keep putting towers there, then the inherent character of the neighborhood would change. You would have singles or younger cohorts without children, and they would demand different kind of services than those who were demanded by parents. And you will see a shift in the social fabric. Is it a good or a bad thing? And the answer is it's neither good nor bad. It's part of evolution. The thing to understand is that when we see high-rise development, we see this either as the builder's dream to build high-rise, or if we see reluctance by the city to deny a high-rise construction as the planners believe that what is the ideal density for that place. Neither the planners nor the builders decide what density is the right density and how high the buildings should be or how high the tower should be at any given place. It's the market that decides. No one builds high-rise condos where the land per square foot is cheap. I have never seen a series of high-rise towers in the outer suburbs, not near transit or not near highways. Why don't people do that? Because the price of land per square foot is not high enough for the builder to start this very expensive construction.
Right.
Places like Yonge and Eglinton and places like downtown Toronto and Yonge and Bloor, along the Yonge line, these are the places that have very high land values that even globally speaking are really high if you were to compare those land values in these choice parcels of land. And it makes absolutely no sense to build anything but the high-rise towers there, because that's what the land price dictates. The thing to do in those circumstances is to be proactive rather than reactive. And the city should look at a 20, 30, 50-year plan to see only high-rise will be built because that's dictated by the market forces. But the goal is to provide enough infrastructure so that you have neither the subgrade or above-grade infrastructure that runs into capacity issues in the near future. By that, I mean that you have to have enough mobility solutions so people should be able to move. You should have enough underground infrastructure in terms of sewers and water mains. And at the same time, equally important is the social infrastructure, parks, recreation places, restaurants, places where people can be face-to-face. That kind of infrastructure has to be there as well, because you don't simply live in this cubicle that's called a condominium and have a urban nirvana in 500 square feet of space.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you were a first-time home buyer, what would you do in this market? Would you purchase something now before prices get too high, or would you hold off waiting for a reprieve in the market?
If I'm a first-time home buyer, I would buy now, because I have no reason to believe that this market is going to slow down or become cheaper. Now, when people say the market may slow down, they're not saying that the prices will drop. All they're saying is that the rate in the increase of prices will decline. So from a first-time home buyers, the question is, are you going to buy something which is X dollars today, or are you going to wait and buy it more expensive tomorrow?
Right.
It's not going to be any cheaper. So that's not going to happen. And even if there's a decline in the number of sales, so Trab sold, 116,000 properties last year. And in the worst case scenario, if that number declines to say 90,000 or 100,000 a year from now, does that mean that the prices will decline? And I highly doubt it. I think the number of sales may decline at some point in the worst case scenario, but the prices may be able to sustain, more likely to sustain, because they're really sticky. So if you're a first-time home buyers, I would say don't expect the prices, housing prices, to decline. If you can come up with the down payment now, beg your parents and anybody else, if you have some inheritance locked up somewhere, be in the good books of your grandparents and granduncles and aunts, get that money now and buy the property, because what you have in your favor right now are highly favorable mortgage rates. And get the property now and get the mortgage rate now. Lock it for as long as you can, because what is not guaranteed even in the near future is that these lucrative mortgage rates will sustain for a year or 2 years down the road. But if you can lock them for 5 years, 10 years, then do it. And there is housing stock that you should look into under $400,000 or around between $400,000 and $500,000 as first-time home buyers. Try to go for it. See if you can find those units. Stay away from areas that offer hype. If you are buying even at $400,000 or $500,000 into a place where the per square foot price is over $1,000 or nearing $1,000 per square foot, stay away from it, because someone else is going to make money off you and get rich off you. Try to find places where dollars per square foot should still in the ranges of, say, $300 to $500 per square foot. Be smart, because the price appreciates on a per square foot basis, not necessarily as a dwelling basis, especially relevant for condominiums more so than for low-rise. So buy now, get the mortgage rates that are more favorable, and do not expect prices to decline this year, next year, and more, extending the same argument maybe a year down the road or 2 years down the road. I don't expect the prices to decline.
Awesome. That's great. That's very good advice. To ease the supply situation for Toronto housing, many are certainly calling for the government to release some of the protected conservation lands. What are your thoughts on how that easing will help the housing supply in Toronto?
Well, there is a supply side constraint. There's no doubt about it. And I think I see very smart people who argue that the supply is not an issue. And I don't agree with them. Again, my approach is more of an urban economics, urban engineering approach. And those who argue supply is not an issue come from an architecture point of view or urban design point of view. But the reality is that the supply of new housing, new units being built in the Greater Toronto area has been constrained, has not increased. So as population increased, the numbers is not increasing. It's the investment in residential real estate in Ontario has been declining, and only recently it has started to recover. Some argue that it is because of the land constraints, that the Places to Grow Act is a contributor. I have a more nuanced response to it. I see the decline in the construction of new housing starting before this act was enforced. So the things that happened before that. So one has to look into what caused the decline to start before the act was put in place. And then there are two parts of it. I think there's the part that restricts construction, residential and otherwise, in certain parts of the GTA, trying to protect environmentally necessary areas. There are watersheds, there are green spaces, there are areas that one should protect. I don't argue that one should, or I don't advise that we should look into those areas and try to build on green fields, especially which areas that are environmentally sensitive. watersheds and whatnot. I'm not in favor of that. But what I am in favor of is allowing builders to build in areas that are already earmarked to be built, but do not impose residential density or built density constraints that the Places to Grow Act has enforced or has incorporated. So there are two types of constraints. A, you can't build there on greenfield, and even if you're building on areas that were designated to be built, you have to build at a certain high density than the builders are willing to build. The problem there is it's not the builders, it's the buyer, the consumer. When you move out 20, 30 kilometers from downtown Toronto and want to live there, you're not essentially looking for high-rise towers or high density or a certain degree of spatial concentration of people and activities. And it's the consumer's desire to be maybe a little less congested than what we are used to in downtown Toronto or even in uptown. And that's why they move out. And then forcing those new consumers to be living in densities or concentration of activities that they themselves don't desire, that's a misstep. And I think if you have to really think about it, you don't argue to release environmentally sensitive areas. I don't think that's a prudent way to go. I think the prudent way to go is to look at the areas that are already earmarked for development and see if the development is not happening there because of these arbitrary density requirements set forth in certain planning documents. One of them is the provincial document. Now, this is something for us to do so because I see there has been a decline, even the population is increasing. But if you think about the region, the Toronto region, so you have Toronto, City of Toronto with 2.7 million people, and you have the Toronto Census Metropolitan Area with about 6 million people. If you look at the increase in population in the region, if you take Toronto out, the Toronto 2.7 million are out, let's just take them out and just look at what is the increase in population in the rest of the region. And that increase is 7.7%. So Toronto grew by 4.5%, and the region minus Toronto grew by 7.7% between 2011 and 16.
Wow, that's pretty
but
significant.
You also need to know that between 2006 and 2011, the City of Toronto again grew by 4.5%. So the rate of growth in the City of Toronto has been consistent since 2006. But the region minus Toronto between 2006 and 2011 grew by 14%. So the rest of the Toronto was growing at 14% between 2006 and 2011. That growth rate has declined by half in the last 5 years, that is 2011 to 2016. And you ask yourself, what are the contributing factors that are resulting in the 905 regions decline in the growth rate of population? And I think one of the reasons is the constraints we have put on residential development, restricting development to certain areas, but more so restricting development by forcing the builders to build at densities that consumers don't want. That, I think, is a bigger problem than one were to argue to build new developments on environmentally sensitive lands. I'm not in favor of building on environmentally sensitive lands. I think we should protect them. We hold this land in trust for future generations, and once you build on it, it's lost forever. But there are ways to build, there are ways to increase supply, and one of the ways to increase it that once you have designated areas, you should look at what consumers want to be built, rather than saying that I, as an urban planner, have come up with an arbitrary density threshold, and I think I should enforce that. So that disconnect between what planners want and what consumers want, if you were to fix that and you bring the two parties closer together, you would see an increase in housing supply, residential construction in 905 regions, so they can continue to grow. Toronto growth rate is going to be 4.5%, 5%. It's going to grow slower in the future, primarily because Toronto is essentially building high-rises. In the past few years, 85% of the new supply of housing in the City of Toronto has been high-rise. less than 15% was low-rise. So you see the average household size should be declining in Toronto, given that new housing we are building is smaller than before. So the real growth in population in terms of number of persons per unit would be higher in the 905 regions, but that wouldn't happen if you were to put artificial constraints in terms of the density at which new developments should be built and also in terms of where the development should go.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense for sure. You know, a lot of people make their housing decisions